Clara Whitmore pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and closed her eyes. Outside, she could hear them laughing. 3 men in expensive coats standing in the middle of Nathaniel Blackwood's pasture, laughing at everything he had spent the last 11 years of his life building. Laughing at the cattle, laughing at the fences, laughing at the cracked earth and the lean animals, and the desperate hope hanging over this ranch like smoke that wouldn't clear. And she knew with the kind of certainty that lives in the gut, not the head, that if she didn't do something in the next hour, Nathaniel Blackwood was going to lose everything. She opened her eyes. She reached for her apron. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single story from this channel. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Clara, because what she did next is something nobody in that valley ever forgot. Montana Territory, 1883. The summer that year came in hard and stayed hard. The sky was pale and dry, the kind of pale that ranchers learned to fear, and the grass in the Blackwood pastures had been struggling since March. Nathaniel Blackwood had been struggling since longer than that. He was 42 years old, and he looked every year of it. Not in a broken way, in the way of a man who had worked without stopping, who had pushed through 2 seasons of drought and falling cattle prices, and a debt at the bank in Billings that had been growing quietly like a sickness. He kept telling himself he'd deal with later. He was broad-shouldered and weather-carved, the kind of man who inspired confidence just by standing still. But lately, even standing still had started to cost him something. His wife Margaret had passed 4 years ago. Fever took her in October quick and without warning, and it had left Nathaniel with a grief he never fully named, and a ranch he kept running because the ranch was all he had left of the life they'd built together. He didn't talk about her much. He didn't talk about much of anything much. He rose before sunrise, worked until dark, ate whatever was set in front of him, and went to bed to do it all again. The ranch had 12 full-time hands, a decent bunkhouse, 2 barns that needed new roofing, and a main house that had been fine when Margaret was alive, but had grown dusty and functional since. There were 340 head of cattle on the property. In a good year, they were worth something real. In a year like this one, drought conditions, low market prices, buyers who came with hard numbers and harder intentions, they were worth considerably less. The 3 buyers from Chicago had arrived 2 days earlier. Their names were Preston Holt Decker Kane and Arthur Finch. They came in a hired coach from Billings wearing wool suits that cost more than a month of Nathaniel's payroll, and carrying themselves with the particular confidence of men who had never been told they were wrong about anything important. Holt was the oldest, 60-ish, gray-bearded and deliberate. Kane was somewhere in his 40s, sharp-eyed and restless. Finch was the youngest, barely 30, and the most talkative, which made him the most dangerous because he spoke fast enough that you sometimes didn't notice what he was actually saying. They represented a meatpacking consortium out of Chicago that had been buying up cattle operations across Montana and Wyoming for the past 3 years. They weren't coming to do Nathaniel a favor. They were coming to assess whether the Blackwood herd was worth purchasing and at what price, and they had made up their minds before they ever stepped off the coach. Nathaniel knew this. He wasn't naive, but he also didn't have a lot of other options, and so he'd met them at the gate with his hat in his hand, metaphorically speaking, and walked them through the property with as much dignity as he could manage. The walk had not gone well. Holt had walked the pastures with his hands clasped behind his back, and said very little, which was more frightening than if he'd said plenty. Kane had crouched near several of the cattle and prodded them with a gloved hand, and made small sounds of dissatisfaction in the back of his throat. Finch had done what Finch apparently always did, which was talk about market conditions, about the drought, about what similar herds in similar conditions had sold for in Wyoming and Colorado. All of it delivered in a pleasant, reasonable tone that was designed to make the terrible price he was building toward sound perfectly sensible. By the time they reached the shade of the main barn, Nathaniel had understood the number they were moving toward. It was less than half of what his cattle were worth, he'd argued. Calmly at first, because he was a man who believed in calm argument. He had figures, he had documentation, He had the records of the herd's breeding lines going back 6 years, showing the quality of the bloodstock, showing what these animals were capable of producing. Holt had glanced at the papers and handed them back without comment. Kane had said, not unkindly, that bloodlines didn't mean much when you were looking at the condition the animals were actually in. Finch had said that the market was the market, and sentiment didn't move numbers. And then they'd laughed. Not at Nathaniel directly. Not with cruelty exactly. Just with the easy, comfortable laughter of men who were very certain they had already won, discussing among themselves the gap between what sellers believed their property was worth and what buyers were willing to pay for it. Nathaniel had walked back toward the house with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and a feeling in his chest like something had started to collapse. That was when Clara Whitmore had stepped out onto the back porch. She had been standing in the kitchen doorway for the better part of the last 20 minutes, listening through the screen. Not eavesdropping out of nosiness. Clara wasn't a nosy woman. She'd been listening because this ranch mattered to her, and because what she was hearing was wrong, and because something deep in the practical center of her was calculating quietly and rapidly whether there was anything to be done about it. She was 32 years old, and she had worked at the Blackwood Ranch for 2 years. She was a large woman. Heavy through the hips and the shoulders, soft-faced and plain-featured. With dark hair she kept pinned back, and hands that were permanently roughened from the work she did. In the town of Ridgeline, 4 miles east, people had opinions about Clara Whitmore. Most of those opinions had formed within about 30 seconds of first seeing her and had never been updated since. She was the cook at the Blackwood Ranch. She was big. She was quiet. She didn't push herself forward or make demands or expect to be noticed. That was all most people had ever bothered to learn about her. What they had not bothered to learn was that Clara Whitmore had been cooking since she was 9 years old. That her mother, who had run a boarding house in Kansas for 20 years, had taught her not just how to prepare food, but how to understand it, how to look at a piece of meat and know what it was, where it came from, what it had been before it arrived on a table, and what it could become in the right hands. Clara could taste a steak and tell you what the animal had been eating. She could tell you how old it was, how it had been raised, whether it had lived a hard life or an easy one. She could tell you things about beef that the men standing in that pasture with their clipboards and their polished boots had never thought to ask. She had spent the last 2 years preparing meals for Nathaniel's ranch hands and for any guests who came through. She had cooked for cattle buyers before. She knew what a buyer who understood beef looked like when he tasted something good. She knew the expression, that particular stillness, the way the fork stopped moving, the way a man's eyes changed when his mouth was telling him something his expectations hadn't prepared him for. She had never once had a reason to make those men feel that expression. Until today. Mr. Blackwood. Nathaniel turned on the back porch steps. He looked tired in a way that went past physical. Clara. He said her name with the flat courtesy of a man who was very far inside his own head. I heard what they offered you. He looked at her for a moment. It ain't your concern. No, she said. I reckon it isn't. She paused. But I know something about those cattle that those men don't know. And I think I can prove it to them in a way they can't argue with. He waited. Let me cook for them, she said. Tonight. Let me prepare the cuts they said proved the herd was low quality. The tougher pieces. The ones your buyer, the one with the gray beard, kept pointing to as evidence. Nathaniel stared at her. You want to cook your way out of a cattle negotiation. I want to let the beef speak for itself, she said. Those men know what good beef tastes like. They've eaten it in the finest restaurants in Chicago. If I can put something on that table tonight that makes them sit up straight, they'll know what they're looking at, and they won't be able to pretend otherwise. Clara, these are businessmen. They don't change their numbers because... They'll change their numbers, she said quietly, if their mouths tell them their numbers are wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and didn't look away. There was something about Clara Whitmore when she made up her mind about something. It wasn't loudness. It wasn't the kind of certainty that tries to persuade. It was the steadier kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you know and trusting it completely. Nathaniel Blackwood was a man who had spent his whole adult life reading people. He had read a lot of them wrong at first, and then right eventually, and he was looking at Clara now the way he looked at things when his instincts were trying to tell him something he hadn't consciously figured out yet. He said, "You've got 1 hour." She nodded once. She turned and went back inside. The kitchen of the Blackwood Ranch was not a beautiful room. The walls were dark with years of smoke. The floorboards were uneven, and the stove was the original one that had been installed when the house was built. 12 years earlier, patched twice and reliable in the particular stubborn way of old things that had earned their right to keep working. The light came from 2 windows facing west, and 2 oil lamps hung from the ceiling beams. Clara knew every inch of it. She moved through the space the way a musician moves around an instrument they've played for years, without thinking about the physical, only about the sound. She pulled the cuts she needed from the cold storage selected with a care that looked casual, but wasn't. These were the exact pieces that Decker Kane had crouched over in the pasture and dismissed. The chuck and the tougher muscles from cattle that hadn't been pampered, that had moved and worked and built themselves lean and close-grained. Most cooks given those cuts would have compensated, would have braised them long or smothered them in something to cover what they were, would have apologized for the meat by hiding it. Clara had no intention of apologizing. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small metal tin flat and dented with a lid that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. Her mother had given it to her when she was 19 and leaving Kansas. Inside was a mixture of dried herbs and seasonings that her mother had developed over 30 years of feeding difficult guests in a boarding house where the food had to do the persuading because the circumstances couldn't. Her mother had never written the formula down anywhere. She'd taught it to Clara by feel and by smell, by watching Clara's hands and correcting them with small adjustments, by saying things like, "Less of that, 1 more patience, let it think for a minute." The tin looked like nothing. Worn metal, a little rust on the hinge. It had no elegance to it, no suggestion of value. To Clara, it was the most important thing she owned. She opened it and began to work. She prepared 25 steaks, not because 25 was a meaningful number in any formal sense, because 25 was how many she could prepare to the standard she needed in the time she had, and because feeding 3 buyers a single plate each wasn't the point. The point was abundance. The point was confidence. The point was setting a table that said without a single spoken word, "We are not afraid of you seeing what we have." She adjusted the fire 4 times in the first 20 minutes, reading the heat, the way you read a face, watching for changes, anticipating what came next, making corrections before corrections were needed. She seasoned each piece with the patience her mother had told her was the real ingredient in every dish she'd ever made. She did not rush. She did not second-guess. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could hear the 3 buyers on the front porch still talking, still calculating. Finch was explaining something to Holt in the tone he used when he thought he was being helpful. Kane had gone quiet, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was satisfied with himself. They thought this was over. She set the table herself. No one helped her. She didn't ask for help. She carried the plates out one at a time, arranged them with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had done this 10,000 times and knew exactly what each step required. She set bread on the table. She set water. She set a small dish of the compound butter she'd prepared from the last of the good cream. She did not make a speech. She did not stand at the head of the table and explain what they were about to eat, or ask them to pay attention, or tell them anything at all about the cattle, or the breeding lines, or the drought conditions. She set the plates down. She said, "Supper's ready, gentlemen," and she walked back to the kitchen. Because Clara Whitmore had learned something very early in her life that most people spent their whole lives learning too late, real quality doesn't announce itself. It waits to be discovered. She stood at the kitchen window. She listened. For a while she heard the sounds of men sitting down the scrape of chairs, the small sounds of silverware and cloth napkins. Finch said something she couldn't make out what, and Holt gave a short reply. There was the sound of cutting, the sound of the first bite, and then silence. Not the silence of men ignoring a meal, the different kind of silence. The silence of men who have stopped talking because their mouths have just told them something that requires all available attention. Clara closed her eyes. She let out a breath. She'd known it would work. She'd known in the same quiet, certain way she'd known most things that mattered in her life, not because she was arrogant about it, but because she understood what she was working with, and she trusted her understanding. But there is a difference between knowing something and hearing the proof of it settle into the room, and that difference lived in the chest somewhere between the ribs, and she felt it now. She opened her eyes. She began washing the pans. Chetta. The silence lasted almost 3 minutes. Finch broke it first, and for once, he didn't sound pleased with himself. "Nathaniel," he said. His voice had changed. The smooth, practiced reasonableness was still there, but underneath it was something else, something cautious. "This came from your herd." Nathaniel had been sitting at the far end of the table, not eating, watching. "Same cattle you walked through this morning," he said. Another silence. Kane set his fork down and picked it up again. That wasn't something Kane did. Clara had observed enough of these men in 2 days to know that Kane was the kind of man who made deliberate, measured movements, and picking up his fork and putting it down and picking it up again was not a deliberate, measured movement. That was a man whose hands were working independently of his brain because his brain was occupied. "The condition of the pastures," Kane started. "The condition of the pastures don't change what's on your plate," Nathaniel said. Holt had not spoken. He was the oldest and the most careful, and he was still eating. He cut another piece. He chewed it slowly. His eyes were on the table, not looking at anything in particular the way a man's eyes go when he's listening to himself think. "Who cooked this?" he asked. "My ranch cook," Nathaniel said. "What's her name?" "Clara Whitmore." Holt nodded as if the name meant something, as if the name deserved to be placed somewhere he could find it again. "Miss Whitmore knows beef," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact being placed on the table alongside the plates. "She does," Nathaniel agreed, and there was something in his voice when he said it that surprised him a little. A weight, a recognition. He glanced toward the kitchen, and through the serving window he could see the shape of Clara at the basin working in the lamplight, her back to the room, unhurried. He had hired her 2 years ago because the previous cook had left, and someone in town had told him Clara was available. He had noticed over those 2 years that the meals were excellent. He had noticed that the ranch hands were happier at mealtime than they'd been before. He had noticed that guests who ate at his table often said something positive about the food. He had filed these observations in the category of things that are working fine and had not looked much further. Looking further right now felt like the beginning of a much longer thought. The negotiation resumed after supper. But it was a different negotiation than the one that had been happening before Clara set those plates on the table. Holt came back to the front porch with a cup of coffee and a different posture. The settled confidence was still there, but it had been adjusted, reorganized. He was a man who had spent 40 years in the cattle business, and 40 years had taught him one thing above everything else: your mouth doesn't lie to you. Your opinions might, your expectations might, the numbers on a spreadsheet built by men who hadn't tasted a thing might. But your mouth, when it encountered something real, told you the truth. "The beef we tasted tonight," Holt said, "is not consistent with the evaluation we completed this morning." "No," Nathaniel said. "It isn't. Which means our evaluation was based on an incomplete picture." "That's a generous way to put it," Nathaniel said. He kept his voice even. He was good at even. Holt glanced at him, and something crossed his face that might have been appreciation for a man who didn't belabor a point when he had the advantage. "What we offered you this morning doesn't reflect what your cattle are actually worth," Holt said. "I think we can all agree on that now." Kane had come out onto the porch. He leaned against the railing and said, "The question is what they are worth." "The question," Nathaniel said, "is whether the 3 of you are going to arrive at the right number, or whether I'm going to need to send a wire to the buyers in Denver I've been in correspondence with." He said it quietly. He'd been saving that card. He wasn't certain the Denver buyers were actually as interested as he'd implied, but he was certain that men who had just been proven wrong about something didn't want to be told a second time that they'd made a mistake. Finch shifted. "We'd want to revisit our figures," he said. "I'd expect so," Nathaniel said. It took another 2 hours. They argued, they countered, they brought out their own papers, and Nathaniel brought out his, and there was a long detailed conversation about market conditions and freight costs and the consortium's existing inventory, and through all of it, Nathaniel felt something he hadn't felt in the better part of a year. He felt solid. He felt like a man standing on ground that held him, because whatever numbers they were throwing around, the argument had already been won. The argument had been won in the kitchen by a woman who hadn't spoken a single word in the negotiation, who hadn't been invited to the table, who was currently, as far as he could tell, still quietly cleaning up in the back of his house. The final number was not quite triple the original offer, but it was close enough that when Holt said it and Nathaniel said he'd accept it, there was a moment before the handshake where Nathaniel Blackwood looked toward the kitchen window and thought something he didn't have words for yet, something that had to do with how long you could look at something every day and still somehow not see it. Holt caught the direction of his glance. "The cook changed the picture," Holt said. Simple words. 5 words, said with genuine acknowledgement, which made them worth something. But they also made Nathaniel's jaw tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Because what they said, what they communicated without meaning to, was that Clara Whitmore, who had just rewritten the future of this ranch in the space of an hour, was still at the end of it, being named by what she did rather than who she was. The cook. He thought about her standing at the kitchen door earlier that evening. "Let me cook for them," said without pleading, without self-promotion. Just a woman who knew what she knew and was willing to use it for something that mattered. He shook Holt's hand. He signed the preliminary agreement. And when the 3 buyers retired to the guest quarters and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the night had settled into the particular quiet of a Montana summer evening, with a breeze coming down off the hills, Nathaniel walked to the kitchen. The lamp was still burning. Clara was finishing the last of the cleaning, moving the way she always moved in that room, without waste, without performance, completely at ease inside the work. She heard him come in. She didn't turn around immediately. She set the last dish on the shelf, dried her hands on the cloth at her waist, and then turned to look at him. "Did they change their offer?" she asked. "Close to triple," he said. Something moved across her face, not surprise, something quieter than surprise. Satisfaction maybe, or the particular piece of a thing that went the way it was supposed to go. "Good," she said. "Clara, you don't need to say anything, Mr. Blackwood." "I think I do," he said. She looked at him, waiting. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, this broad, weather-worn man, who had faced down 2 years of drought and debt and grief, without asking a soul for help, and he was looking at her the way you look at something when you're seeing it for the first time, even though it's been right in front of you all along. "That tin in your apron," he said finally. "The one with the herbs." She touched her pocket. "My mother's," she said. "I've seen you use it for 2 years," he said. "Every significant meal this ranch has ever produced. I never once asked you what was in it." She was quiet. "I never asked," he said, "because I didn't think to ask. Because I put you in a category in my head, and I left you there, and everything you are that doesn't fit that category, I just didn't see." He paused. "I saw it tonight. When Holt said your beef couldn't have come from the cattle he'd walked through this morning. When I watched 3 men who've been in this business 40 years between them have to sit down and reconsider everything they thought they knew." Another pause. "That was you. All of it." Clara kept her eyes on him. "What are you saying, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She didn't rush him toward the point. "I'm saying I owe you more than wages," he said. "And I'm saying I don't know yet exactly what that means. But I know that whatever kept this ranch alive tonight came out of this kitchen, and the only person in this kitchen was you, and I intend to remember that in a way that's worth something to you." The lamplight moved between them, warm and low. Clara Whitmore looked at this man who had just for the first time in 2 years actually spoken to her, not to give her instructions, not to acknowledge her work in passing, but actually spoken to her as one person to another, and she thought about everything she had not said over those 2 years. Every observation she'd kept to herself. Everything she'd known and not been asked about. She thought about her mother, who had spent 30 years feeding strangers in a Kansas boarding house, and had been loved by the town, and respected by everyone who sat at her table, but who had died, having never owned a single thing she lived in. Clara had no intention of going the same way. "Then when you figure out what it means," she said quietly, "come and find me." She untied her apron. She folded it. She set it on the counter, and she walked past him out the kitchen door into the warm Montana night. Nathaniel Blackwood did not sleep that night. He sat on the front porch until the sky started to gray at the edges, and he did what he almost never did, which was nothing. No ledger in his lap, no list of things to be done in the morning, no plans being turned over and examined. Just sitting. Just the dark and the sound of the horses shifting in the corral, and somewhere far off, a coyote calling to something that didn't answer. He kept thinking about what Holt had said. The cook changed the picture. And he kept coming back to the same place he'd been coming back to all night. The fact that Clara Whitmore had walked into his kitchen 2 years ago and had been changing things ever since, and he had not once stopped to look at what she was actually doing. That bothered him in a way he didn't have a comfortable name for. He was a man who prided himself on seeing clearly, on making sound judgments about land and cattle and weather and people. He had built everything he had on his ability to assess a situation accurately and respond to what was actually there, not what he expected to find. And yet, he had looked at Clara every single day for 2 years and seen only what he'd decided she was on the first day. A cook competent, reliable, occupying the kitchen without ever looking past the surface of that to what was underneath. The buyers had done the same thing with his cattle. They'd walked through the pastures, made their assessments, arrived at a number. They'd been wrong. The evidence had been right in front of them, and they'd been wrong. He wondered what else he'd been wrong about. When the sun came up and the ranch hands started moving, Nathaniel went inside, washed his face, and went to find Clara. She was already in the kitchen. She'd been there since before dawn, he could tell from the way the stove was burning steady and established. She was preparing breakfast for the hands moving through the kitchen, with that unhurried economy he'd come to recognize without ever consciously noticing it. She heard him come in. She didn't stop what she was doing. "Sleep well?" she asked, not turning around. "No," he said. "I didn't reckon you would." He stood in the kitchen doorway. "I've been thinking about what I said last night." "You can think about it as long as you need to," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "That's what I want to talk to you about," he said. "The going nowhere part." She turned then. She was holding a wooden spoon, and her apron was already dusted with flour, and her hair was pinned back the way it always was, and she looked at him with those calm, dark eyes that didn't ask for anything and didn't give away more than she intended. "I'm listening," she said. "I want to give you a formal role," he said. "A real one. Not just the kitchen. I want you involved in the operation, in decisions about the herd, about buyers, about what we present and how we present it. You understand this ranch in ways my hands don't. You proved that last night." She was quiet for a moment. "A formal role," she repeated. "Yes. What does that mean exactly?" "Mr. Blackwood, does it mean you'll listen to me when I have something to say? Or does it mean you'll listen to me in the kitchen and then go make the decisions yourself and call it collaboration?" The question landed cleanly. He didn't flinch from it. "I deserve that," he said. "I'm not saying it to punish you. I'm saying it because I've been in those arrangements before." She turned back to the stove. "A woman who knows something gets a title and a pat on the back and then spends the next 3 years watching men make the decisions she should have been making and being thanked for her input which they did not take. That isn't what I'm offering." "Then what are you offering?" He leaned against the doorframe. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know it's more than wages and a title. And I know I mean it. And I know you've got no particular reason to believe that, given that I spent 2 years not seeing what was right in front of me, so I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you what I mean." Clara stirred the pot on the stove. The kitchen smelled of coffee and something spiced and warm. She said without turning around, "The buyers, when do they leave?" "This afternoon." "Before they leave," she said, "I want to be in the room when the final terms are confirmed." Nathaniel blinked. "That's not... Is it a formal role or isn't it?" A beat of silence. "All right," he said. She nodded once, still not turning around. "Then, I'll have breakfast on the table in 20 minutes. The final meeting with Holt, Kane, and Finch happened at noon in the front room of the main house at the same table where they'd eaten Clara's steaks the night before. Nathaniel had told the 3 buyers that his ranch manager would be joining them for the confirmation of terms. Holt had said, "Of course," without looking up from his papers. Kane had said nothing. Finch had looked toward the door with the polite incomprehension of a man waiting to see what a ranch manager looked like on this particular operation. When Clara walked in carrying a notepad and a pen, and wearing a clean dress and her apron because she'd kept the apron deliberately, because she had nothing to prove about who she was or where she'd come from, Finch's face had gone through several small changes in quick succession. Surprise. Reassessment. A reflexive instinct to say something charming. And then underneath all of it, the cautious recalibration of a man who had been wrong once in the last 24 hours and was not eager to be wrong again. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, "this is Clara Whitmore. She'll be sitting in on the final terms." Holt looked up. He looked at Clara. He nodded. One short, respectful nod, the kind he gave people he considered worth nodding to. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Holt," she said. She sat down at the table and opened her notepad. Kane watched her the way he watched everything, with that flat, assessing gaze that revealed nothing and took in everything. He didn't say her name. But he didn't dismiss her either, which Clara understood was the closest thing to courtesy she was likely to get from a man like Kane. Finch said, "You're the one who cooked the steaks," and immediately looked like he wished he'd said something different. Clara met his eyes. "Among other things," she said, and that was the end of the introduction. The terms took 2 hours to finalize. It wasn't a comfortable 2 hours. Finch tried twice to reopen elements of the price that had been agreed the night before, framing each attempt as a clarification rather than a renegotiation, which Clara recognized immediately as a technique. The second time he did it, she put her pen down and said, "Mr. Finch, the price per head was confirmed last night with a handshake. If you're revisiting that, I'd ask you to say so plainly, because I've got work to get back to, and I'd rather not spend time discussing something we've already settled." Finch blinked. Kane made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh quickly swallowed. Holt glanced at her over his papers with an expression that was entirely neutral but had something behind it that she chose to file away for later. "The price stands," Finch said, recovering his pleasant tone. "I was only checking the language." "The language is fine," Clara said. She picked her pen back up. "Please continue." When it was over, and the 3 buyers had shaken hands with Nathaniel and were gathering their coats and papers, Holt paused at the door. He looked at Clara, who was reviewing the notes she'd taken. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up. "My consortium will be purchasing cattle in this territory again next spring," he said. "I'd appreciate knowing whether you're still with this operation when that time comes." It was not a small thing to say. Holt said it the way he said everything quietly, precisely without decoration. But the weight of it was real. He was telling her in the language of practical men that she was the variable he wanted accounted for. Not the land, not even the cattle. Her. Clara held his gaze. "I expect I will be," she said. Holt nodded. "Good." He put on his hat and walked out. What happened next happened fast in the way that bad things in a small valley usually do, accelerating from a rumor to a fact before most people have had time to decide how they feel about the rumor. Word got around Ridgeline inside of a week. The Blackwood Ranch had sold at close to triple the expected price. The Chicago buyers, who were known across 3 territories as hard-nosed and unsentimental, had changed their numbers. There had been a negotiation that didn't go the way negotiations like that were supposed to go. People wanted to know why, and the story that came back to them, partly from one of the ranch hands who'd been in earshot, partly from Finch, who had his own version of events that emphasized his own graciousness in the matter, was that the Blackwood cook had done something. The cook. The big woman from the kitchen. The story got told in different ways by different people. By the time it reached the Ridgeline General Store and the barbershop and the back tables of the saloon, it had acquired the particular texture of a story that people didn't know how to categorize, and so were telling as a kind of curiosity. An oddity. Did you hear what happened out at Blackwood's? The cook talked her way into a cattle negotiation. The cook changed the deal. Well, not talked exactly. She cooked for them. She made steaks. And the buyers. This was the part people kept returning to, the part that didn't quite fit their understanding of the world. The buyers changed their numbers because of the food. Some people found it charming. An unusual story, a good outcome for a decent man who'd had a rough couple of years. Others found it unsettling in the way that things are unsettling when they don't match the shape of how things are supposed to work. A woman who cooked and cleaned, inserting herself into serious business. A fat woman at that, which people said with a particular inflection that was meant to convey something about credibility and place. A man named Gerald Pruitt said it loudest. Pruitt ran the only land brokerage in Ridgeline. He was 55, red-faced, possessed of the permanent confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged in his professional life, and he had been circling the Blackwood property for the better part of a year. He'd had his own buyers lined up, buyers who would have purchased at even lower numbers than Holt's original offer, and from whom Pruitt would have collected a finder's fee that would have been meaningful. He'd been building toward that deal quietly, saying nothing to Nathaniel directly, simply waiting for the desperation to become complete enough that Blackwood would come to him. That had not happened. And the reason it had not happened was a woman named Clara Whitmore, and Pruitt had opinions about that. He said them in the saloon 3 days after the deal was signed. "I don't know what Blackwood thinks he's doing," Pruitt said to the 4 men sitting around him, who had the good sense to listen and the bad sense to encourage him. Letting his cook run business negotiations. A woman like that sitting at a table with Chicago buyers. It's embarrassing. It's the kind of thing that makes the whole valley look like it doesn't know how to operate. One of the 4 men said, "I heard she did all right. She cooked some steaks," Pruitt said. "That's what she did. That's what she's for. And now Blackwood's got her playing ranch manager and God only knows what else, and when it goes sideways, he's going to be the one dealing with the fallout." He picked up his glass. A man like Blackwood should know better than to let sentiment cloud his judgment. Word of what Pruitt said got back to Nathaniel by the following morning. It got back to Clara by that afternoon. She was in the garden behind the kitchen checking the herbs she kept in 3 raised beds along the south wall, when one of the younger hands, a boy named Ellis, 18 and earnest, and chronically unable to keep anything to himself, came around the corner of the house with the particular expression of someone carrying news he wasn't sure he should be carrying. "Miss Clara," he said. "Ellis." She didn't look up from the herbs. "You hear what Pruitt's saying in town?" "I heard something." She pinched a stem of rosemary and held it up to check the leaves. "Say it straight." Ellis said it straight. He repeated Pruitt's words with the uncomfortable accuracy of someone who had memorized them before deciding whether to share them, which told her the words had hit him somewhere that required remembering. Clara listened. She kept her hands in the herb bed. She did not change her expression. When Ellis finished, she said, "Thank you, Ellis." "Don't you want to?" "Want to what?" He shifted his weight. "I don't know. Do something about it." "I am doing something about it," she said. She pushed herself to her feet and brushed the dirt from her hands. "I'm growing better herbs, and then I'm going to cook better food, and Pruitt is going to keep talking in saloons, which is what Pruitt has always done, and we're going to keep improving this ranch, which is what I intend to do." She looked at Ellis. "Which one of those two things do you think matters in 5 years?" Ellis thought about it with the serious expression of a boy who was trying hard to become a man who thought before he spoke. "Yours," he said. "Good answer," she said. She walked back toward the kitchen. "Go finish the fence on the east pasture." Nathaniel rode into Ridgeline the next morning. He had business at the bank. The debt that the sale had allowed him to address was not going to address itself without paperwork. And he had business at the dry goods store, and he had in the back of his mind the awareness that Gerald Pruitt's office was on the main street, and that Pruitt's habit was to arrive at that office by 9 and stay until noon. He did not plan to visit Pruitt. He did not go in with that intention. But Pruitt was standing on the boardwalk outside his office when Nathaniel rode past, and their eyes met, and there was a moment where Nathaniel could have nodded and kept riding, and the thing would have passed. He didn't. He pulled up, he dismounted. He tied the horse to the hitching post and stepped up onto the boardwalk. Pruitt watched him come with the careful expression of a man who had been saying things in saloons and was now doing the rapid calculation of how much of those things the person walking toward him might have heard. "Blackwood," he said. "Pruitt." Nathaniel stood close enough that the conversation stayed between them. Not hostile, Nathaniel wasn't a man who led with hostility, but close. "I heard you've been talking about my operation." Pruitt straightened slightly. "I've been talking about a lot of things, specifically about how I'm running my business and who I'm running it with." "I may have had some thoughts," Pruitt said, recovering his composure, "about the wisdom of certain arrangements. As a matter of professional observation." "As a professional observation," Nathaniel said, keeping his voice level. "I closed a deal last week at close to triple what you would have arranged for me with your buyers, so I'm going to decline your professional observations." Pruitt's face reddened slightly. "It was a one-time thing, Blackwood. A cook making good steaks doesn't—" "Her name is Clara Whitmore," Nathaniel said. Pruitt stopped. "She's not the cook. She's not a woman like that. Her name is Clara Whitmore, and she saved this ranch, and I'd appreciate you using her name when you discuss her." He held Pruitt's gaze for a moment. "Professional observation." He stepped off the boardwalk, untied his horse, and rode toward the bank. He didn't look back, but the boardwalk behind him was very quiet. The ranch hands had their own opinions. Most of them had been at the Blackwood Ranch long enough to have formed a settled view of Clara. She was the cook. She was good at her job, she was fair and not mean-spirited, and she made the kind of meals that made a difficult day feel worth finishing. They respected her, the way you respect a fixed and reliable thing, without thinking about it much. What had happened with the Chicago buyers had knocked that settled view slightly sideways, and the hands were in the process of adjusting. Some of them adjusted quickly and without drama. A man named Harlan, who was the oldest of the hands at 53 and had worked cattle operations across 5 states, had apparently absorbed the news of Clara's role in the negotiation, thought about it for approximately 1 day, and arrived at the conclusion that he should have figured this out 2 years ago, and that he was mildly annoyed with himself for not having done so. He had said good morning to Clara the day after the deal was signed, with a different quality of attention in his voice. Clara had noticed. She had said good morning back. Others adjusted more slowly. There was a hand named Boyd, mid-30s, competent enough at the work, the kind of man who needed a clear hierarchy to feel oriented, who had spent 3 days visibly wrestling with what it meant that the woman who cooked his supper was now apparently in meetings with cattle buyers. He wasn't cruel about it. He just got quieter and more careful around her, which Clara recognized as the behavior of a man who didn't know what category to put her in anymore. She didn't push Boyd. She had found over her life that pushing men like Boyd rarely accomplished what direct engagement could. You had to wait for the moment when they needed something from you that they couldn't get from anyone else. And then you gave it to them honestly, and after that the hierarchy question usually sorted itself out. That moment came sooner than she expected. Odd. A week after the buyers left one of the herd's prime bulls, a 4-year-old named in the record books as Blackwood King but called simply King by everyone on the ranch went off his feed. It wasn't dramatic at first, subtle changes that a man walking past a pasture wouldn't catch. But Clara had spent 2 years preparing beef from this herd, and part of that, the part nobody thought about, was that she paid attention to the animals before they became meat. She noticed which ones were thriving and which ones weren't. She had mentioned it to Nathaniel the previous year when a heifer had shown similar signs, and Nathaniel had listened, and the heifer had been seen to and had been fine. She noticed King on a Tuesday morning when she was walking to the garden. She stopped. She watched him for a minute. She went back inside, made a note, and went to find Nathaniel. He was in the north barn with 2 of the hands, including Boyd. "King's not right," she said from the barn doorway. "He hasn't been eating proper for at least 2 days, maybe 3. He's favoring his left rear just slightly, and his eyes don't look clear." Nathaniel turned. Behind him, she saw Boyd's expression, the slight flicker of something that wasn't quite dismissal, but was adjacent to it. A cook talking about a prize bull. "You sure?" Nathaniel said. "Go look at him." Nathaniel went and looked. He came back 15 minutes later with his mouth set in the way it set when something was wrong. "You're right," he said. "I'm going to send for the veterinarian from Billings." He looked at her. "How long do you think he's been showing signs?" "3 days is my best guess," she said. "Maybe 4. Boyd had come out of the barn while they were talking. He was looking at the ground in the way of a man recalibrating. "How did she—" He started, and then stopped himself, apparently recognizing mid-sentence that the sentence he was about to complete reflected poorly on him. Clara answered the question he hadn't finished. "Because I pay attention," she said without sharpness. "To everything on this ranch, not just the kitchen." Boyd looked up at her. She held his gaze steadily. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back to work. It was the first time Boyd had called her ma'am. It was not something he was required to do. She outranked nobody officially. But ma'am was the word a man used in the West when he had decided in his own internal accounting that someone had earned a particular kind of respect. Clara filed it away. The veterinarian came from Billings 2 days later and confirmed what Clara had suspected: a hoof infection in the early stages, entirely treatable if caught when it was. If it had been missed for another week, the bull, Nathaniel's most valuable breeding animal, the one whose bloodlines had been a central part of the argument with the Chicago buyers, would have been in serious danger. Nathaniel didn't make a speech about it. He wasn't a speech-making man. But that evening at supper, when the hands were all at the table and the noise of a working ranch at the end of a long day was filling the room, he looked up from his plate and said to the table in general, "Clara caught King's infection 4 days before any of us would have noticed. We might have lost him." The table went quiet. "I want that noted," he said, and went back to his food, too. Clara, carrying a pot of coffee around the table, kept moving. But something in her chest did a thing it didn't often do. It felt, she thought, like being seen. Not just noticed. Not just thanked. Seen. Two weeks after the buyers left, Nathaniel sat down with Clara at the kitchen table after supper with a ledger open between them. This was new. He had never brought a ledger to the kitchen table. The kitchen table was where people ate. Business happened in the front room at the big desk where Margaret had kept the household accounts and where Nathaniel had subsequently kept everything. Bringing the ledger to the kitchen meant something. It was a small thing, a physical thing, but Clara understood the language of physical things. "I want to talk about what the money from the sale allows us to do," he said. "In terms of the herd, the land, the buildings." He opened the ledger to a page of numbers. "I have ideas, but I want to know what you see." Clara sat across from him and looked at the ledger. She had thoughts. She had a lot of thoughts because she had been observing this ranch for 2 years with the quiet attention she gave to everything, and she had a list in her head that she had never been asked about. She started talking. She talked about the breeding program and which of the current lines she thought were underperforming. She talked about the east pasture and how the grass had been recovering since the drought eased and what she thought it could support by spring. She talked about the bunkhouse roof, which the hands had been complaining about for months. and the kitchen stove, which she had been coaxing along past its reasonable lifespan. She talked about the relationship with the buyers in Denver, which Nathaniel had mentioned during the negotiation, and which she thought deserved to be more than a threat. She talked for 45 minutes. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The breeding program observation, about the Hereford cross." "Yes." "That's something I've been thinking about for a year," he said. "I hadn't told anyone because I wasn't sure enough." "I've been thinking about it for 6 months," she said. "I wasn't sure whose place it was to say." He looked at her. "It's your place. Whatever you see on this ranch, it's your place to say." She held his gaze. "Then I need that in writing at some point." He didn't blink. "I know." And there it was again, that thing she had been trying to decide if she could trust. The directness of it. The absence of evasion or deferral, or the comfortable vagueness that men used when they meant well but didn't want to commit. He meant it. She wasn't certain yet what it would look like. She wasn't naive enough to assume that meaning it and doing it were the same thing, not without watching for a while longer. But he was looking at her across a kitchen table with a ledger open between them at 9 o'clock at night, and he had listened to 45 minutes of her observations without once looking at the door, and that was something she hadn't been given before and wasn't going to take lightly. "All right," she said. She pulled the ledger toward her and pointed at the column he'd been working on. "You've miscounted the freight cost on the spring estimates," she said. He looked where she was pointing. "I have," he said. "It's an easy mistake," she said, reaching for the pen. "I'll fix it," he said, reaching for it at the same time. Their hands reached the pen at the same moment, and they both stopped, and there was a beat of stillness that was not about the pen at all, and they both understood that, and neither of them said anything about it. Clara withdrew her hand. "You fix it," she said. He fixed it. But for a long moment after neither of them spoke, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Montana night was wide and dark, and full of the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of things that are growing slowly building toward something neither of them had words for, yet gathering the way weather gathers out past the hills beyond what either of them could quite see from where they were sitting. The ledger stayed on the kitchen table that night, long after both of them had gone to bed. Clara had left it there deliberately. Not out of carelessness. Clara never left things out of carelessness, but because a ledger on a kitchen table meant something had changed, and she wanted to see it in the morning as proof that she hadn't imagined it. She saw it in the morning. She made coffee, looked at it, and went to work. The weeks that followed had a different rhythm than the weeks before. Not dramatically different, the ranch still ran on the same bones. It had always run on the same rising before dawn, the same long days, the same Montana sky pressing down hot and wide in August. But underneath the surface of daily work, something had shifted in the way that fault lines shift before anyone on the ground notices the landscape has changed. Nathaniel started asking her things. Not performing the asking, not making a ceremony of consulting her for the benefit of the hands who might be watching. Just stopping in the kitchen doorway, or catching her on the way to the garden, or appearing beside her at the corral fence and asking. What did she think about moving the younger heifers to the north pasture before the grass got any shorter? Whether she'd noticed anything different about the water quality in the east tank. What her read was on Ellis developing as a hand. Did she think the boy had the makings of a foreman, or was he going to need years yet? She answered everything straight. He listened, and then went and did what he thought was right. Sometimes what she'd said, and sometimes not. And either way he came back and told her what he'd decided, and why. That part, the coming back, the explaining, was the part that surprised her most. It was the part that cost him something. It went against the grain of a man who had spent his adult life making decisions alone and bearing the consequences alone, and doing it quietly because that was what the work required. He was trying. She saw it clearly, the effort of it, and she respected it in the precise way she respected all difficult things, without sentimentality, without needing it to be more than it was, but fully and without reservation. What she didn't do was make it easy by pretending not to notice. Because she had done that before in other situations, and she had learned that making things easy for people who were in the process of growing was not kindness. It was the comfortable form of abandonment. So when Nathaniel asked her what she thought, she told him what she actually thought, including the times when what she thought was that he was making a mistake. The first time she said that. The first time she said, "I think you're wrong about this." And here's why she watched his jaw tighten. Watched him take the breath of a man who had been contradicted and was deciding what to do with it. Watched the moment where it could have gone either way. And then he said, "Walk me through your reasoning." Not dismissal. Not defense. Just walk me through it. She walked him through it. He disagreed with 2 of her points, agreed with 1, and said he needed to think about the rest. 3 days later, he came back and said she'd been right, and they adjusted course accordingly. That exchange cost him something too. She stored it in the same place she stored the ledger on the kitchen table, and Holt's nod, and Boyd calling her ma'am for the first time. She was building something internal, a structure of evidence, because she was not a woman who operated on hope. She operated on evidence, and the evidence was accumulating. It was Harlan who first told her about the land problem. Harlan was not a man who gossiped. He was too old and too tired of people for gossip. When he came to find Clara on a Thursday morning in early September, appearing at the kitchen door with his hat in both hands, and the expression of someone who had been debating this visit for a while, she knew immediately that whatever he had to say was serious. "Got something you need to hear," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, unusual in itself because Harlan almost never sat at the kitchen table, that being a space he considered hers, and he set his hat on his knee and said, "Pruitt's been moving." She turned from the stove. "Moving how?" "He's been talking to the bank in Billings," Harlan said. "My cousin works there. Not in a position to know everything, but enough to know that Pruitt's had 2 meetings with the loan officer in the last month, and both times Blackwood Ranch came up." Clara kept her voice even. "What specifically?" "Nathaniel's debt," Harlan said. "Most of it got cleared with the sale, you know that. But there's still a note on the east parcels, the 40 acres along the creek. Pruitt's been my cousin wasn't specific, but the word was that Pruitt's been asking questions about the terms of that note. When it's due, what the conditions are, whether there's any flexibility in the bank's position." Clara was quiet for a moment. She understood what this meant. A land broker asking questions about the terms of a debt note was not idle curiosity. Pruitt was looking for a window. If that note came due at the wrong moment, if the bank could be persuaded to call it in, under terms that Nathaniel couldn't immediately meet, the east parcels could become vulnerable. And the east parcels weren't just 40 acres along a creek. They were the water access for the entire north pasture. Without them, a significant portion of the herd's grazing land became unworkable. "When's the note due?" she asked. "November," Harlan said. "1st of November." 6 weeks. "Does Nathaniel know any of this?" Harlan shook his head. "That's why I came to you." She looked at him. "Why me and not him directly?" Harlan was quiet for a beat. He turned his hat over once in his hands. "Because you'll know what to do with it," he said. "Nathaniel's a good man. He's a hard worker and he's fair, and I've ridden for him for 8 years without a single regret. But when it comes to the kind of thing where someone's working angles behind the scenes, where the problem isn't the cattle or the weather, but a man who's moving pieces quiet and slow." He stopped. "You see that kind of thing. He doesn't always." Clara nodded once. "Thank you, Harlan," she said. He put his hat on and left. She stood in the kitchen for exactly 2 minutes thinking. Then she went to find Nathaniel. She found him at the north fence, mending wire with 2 of the hands. She waited until she could get him alone, which took about 10 minutes, and then she said, "I need to talk to you about the east parcel note." He turned. Something in her voice had warned him already. "What about it?" "When did you last talk to the bank in Billings about the terms?" "Before the sale," he said slowly. "I was planning to go in after the 1st of September once everything was settled." "Why?" She told him what Harlan had told her. She watched his face go through several things. Surprise first, then recognition, because he knew Gerald Pruitt had known him for years, and the behavior she was describing was not entirely out of character for the man, just more aggressive than he'd expected. Then something harder. Not anger exactly. The particular set of a man who has just understood that he was nearly outmaneuvered and is now running the calculation of how close it actually came. He can't force the bank to call the note, Nathaniel said. He can make a compelling case that it's in the bank's interest to, Clara said, especially if he's already got buyers lined up for the parcels and he's offering them a finder's cut. Banks don't love holding notes on drought-affected property, Nathaniel. If someone credible is in their ear suggesting the risk is higher than it looks, the risk isn't higher than it looks. We know that, she said. The bank needs to know it too, before Pruitt finishes his argument. Nathaniel was quiet. What are you thinking? He asked. I'm thinking you need to be in Billings before the end of next week, she said. And I'm thinking you shouldn't go alone. He looked at her. You want to come? It wasn't a question. He was reading her the way he'd started reading her, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the thing she wasn't quite saying was usually as important as the thing she was. I know the numbers on that note better than you do, she said. I've been through the ledger. I know the repayment history, the outstanding balance, the terms. I can make the case for the ranch's current position in a way that... Clara. His voice was quiet, not interrupting exactly, stopping her from having to make the practical argument when they both knew the practical argument wasn't the only thing happening here. She waited. You don't have to sell me on it, he said. I'll let you know when to pack a bag. Gad. They rode to Billings on a Monday. Nathaniel had wired ahead to arrange a meeting with the bank's senior loan officer, a man named Tolliver, who had handled the Blackwood accounts for 6 years. Clara had spent the weekend going through every document related to the East parcel note, organizing the repayment history, calculating the current equity position against the outstanding debt, building the clearest possible picture of what the ranch's financial health actually looked like for someone who hadn't been watching it daily. She brought everything in a leather satchel that had belonged to her mother. They took the wagon because it was practical and because Nathaniel had additional business in Billings that required hauling capacity, and because taking the wagon rather than riding meant they sat side by side for 4 hours each way, which was a different kind of proximity than the kitchen table with a ledger between them. For the first hour, they talked about ranch business, the breeding program, the East pasture, King's recovery, which had been complete and encouraging. Then the conversation shifted into the quieter territory of people who are comfortable enough with each other to stop performing productivity. Nathaniel said, "You ever think about going back to Kansas?" She looked at the road ahead. "Sometimes, less than I used to." "What changed?" She was quiet for a moment. "I stopped waiting to go back and started paying attention to where I was." She paused. "That's something my mother used to say. She said most people spend their whole lives being somewhere they're not, standing in one place and looking toward another." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did that for a long time after Margaret passed." She didn't rush in to fill the space. She let the name sit between them the way it deserved to sit. After a while, he said, "She would have liked you." Clara looked at him. He was watching the road, not her, his hands easy on the reins. "That's a kind thing to say," she said. "It isn't kindness," he said. "It's accurate. She had no patience for people who couldn't think straight, and she would have respected that about you." He paused. "She also had no patience for people who wouldn't speak their minds, and she would have respected that too." "She sounds like she was formidable," Clara said. "She was. A beat. So are you." It was said simply, without decoration. Not an attempt at anything, just a thing he'd thought and said because he was. She had come to understand a man who said what he thought when he decided the thing was worth saying, and said it plainly. Clara looked at the road. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The meeting with Tolliver lasted 2 hours, Tolliver was a careful man, 50-ish, well-dressed, in the particular way of small city banking men, polite in a guarded way that told you he had learned long ago not to show his hand early. He had welcomed Nathaniel with the practiced warmth of a man greeting a client. He had welcomed Clara with a brief assessing look that he quickly covered with professional courtesy, and then he had proceeded to address the next 20 minutes almost exclusively to Nathaniel. Clara let it go for 20 minutes. At the 20-minute mark, Tolliver began to talk about the East parcel note in terms that were technically accurate but carefully framed, emphasizing the outstanding balance, the approaching due date, the general uncertainty of cattle markets in the region. He was not threatening. He was not doing anything explicitly wrong. He was simply presenting information in an arrangement that was, Clara recognized, consistent with someone having primed him recently to present it that way. She opened her mother's leather satchel. "Mr. Tolliver," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man being interrupted and being too professional to show it. "I have the repayment history on the East parcel note for the last 4 years, she said, setting the papers on the desk between them. "I also have the current equity calculation for the entire ranch property, including the north parcels that aren't subject to any debt. And I have the documentation from the sale that closed 3 weeks ago, which I believe you've received a copy of, but perhaps haven't had time to review fully." She set each document down in turn. Neat. Organized. Impossible to dismiss. Tolliver looked at the papers. He looked at her. "You are," he started. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Ranch manager at Blackwood. These are our accounts." Ranch manager. She had not discussed that title with Nathaniel before using it. She used it because it was accurate in everything except the paperwork, and she was done being inaccurate about what she was. She glanced at Nathaniel. He met her eyes and gave her the smallest possible nod. Permission and acknowledgement at once. She looked back at Tolliver. "The repayment history shows 0 defaults over 48 months. The current equity position is stronger than it's been in 4 years, improved significantly by the sale. The note due in November represents 18% of current ranch equity, which is well within any reasonable risk threshold for a property with this repayment record." She kept her voice even. Factual. Completely without aggression. "I'm not sure what information you've received recently that might suggest otherwise, but I'd like to address it directly if you'll tell me what it is." Tolliver was still for a moment. Then he said carefully, "I've had some inquiries from outside parties." "I assumed so," Clara said. "Who?" Another pause. Tolliver was a careful man, but he was also a man who had just been presented with 4 years of impeccable documentation by a woman who clearly knew exactly what she was talking about, and who had identified his position accurately enough that denying it entirely was no longer a reasonable option. "A Mr. Pruitt," he said. "Land brokerage." "And what was the nature of his inquiry?" He expressed concern about the ranch's ability to meet the November obligation. "Based on what evidence?" Tolliver shifted slightly. He described conditions on the property that suggested that he observed 2 months ago, Clara said, before the sale, before King's recovery, before the fall rotation we completed last week. She turned another paper around on the desk. "This is the current headcount and estimated market value of the herd as of last Friday. You'll note the bull's breeding value has been confirmed by the veterinarian from Billings, who attended him last month. Dr. Pierce, I believe you know his practice, and that value alone represents a significant asset improvement over what Pruitt would have described." She paused. "Mr. Tolliver Gerald Pruitt has a specific financial interest in acquiring access to the East parcels. I don't know what he's offered you or what arrangement he might have suggested, and I'm not accusing you of anything improper. But I'd ask you to look at what's in front of you on this desk and tell me whether the Blackwood Ranch looks like a property in financial danger." Tolliver looked at the papers. He looked at them for a long time. The room was very quiet. Then he said, "I'll need to review everything formally, but—" He stopped, started again. "The documentation is thorough." "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He looked at Nathaniel. "You'll be meeting the November obligation." "In full," Nathaniel said, "and early if you need assurance before the date." Tolliver nodded. He gathered the papers she'd laid out carefully with the precision of a man who understood he was handling something that had just reset the terms of his understanding. "I don't anticipate any concerns," he said. "I appreciate you coming in." They stood to go. At the door, Tolliver said, "Miss Whitmore?" She turned. "That is thorough work," he said. It cost him something to say it, she could tell. He was not a man who found it natural to direct professional praise at a woman he hadn't expected to be dealing with. But he said it because it was true, and he was at bottom a man who respected true things. "Thank you," she said. They walked out into the Billings street. Nathaniel walked half a block in silence. Then he stopped and looked at her. "Ranch manager," he said. "Is that a problem?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's accurate." Another beat. "It's also not what I'm building toward." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I have some things to figure out," he said. "Paperwork, legal arrangements, the kind of thing that takes time to do correctly." He held her gaze. "It means I'm asking you to be patient with me for a little while longer." She studied his face. The weather-worn honesty of it. The way he said difficult things without decorating them. "I've been patient for 2 years," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking for less time than that." She started walking again. "Don't make me wait past spring," she said. He caught up to her. She could hear without looking the sound that might have been him starting to smile. The ride home was different from the ride out. Something had been settled in Billings, and not just with the bank. Something between them, some negotiation that had been running quietly underneath everything else, had moved to a new position. When they were an hour out from Ridgeline and the sun was getting low, Nathaniel said, "Pruitt's going to try again." "Yes," she said. "He's not going to stop because we made a strong case to the bank." "No," she said. "He's going to try something else. He'll look for another angle." "What do you think it'll be?" She thought about Pruitt, about the particular vanity of a man who had decided that being outmaneuvered by a woman on property that he had already counted as his was a personal offense that required redress. "He'll try to come at it from the community side," she said. "He'll make it about respectability, about what it looks like for the Valley Nathaniel Blackwood running his ranch with a woman as his manager. He'll appeal to the men in town who have uncomfortable feelings about it, and he'll frame it as a reasonable concern about proper order." She paused. "He'll make it about me specifically, my weight, my background, my position. He'll make it seem like your judgment is compromised." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You've seen this before," he said. "I've lived this before," she said. "In 3 different places before I came here." "What happened?" "In the first place I left," she said, "because I was 22, and I didn't know yet that leaving just meant starting over somewhere else with the same problem." She paused. "In the second place I tried to be quieter and smaller and less. I thought if I took up less space, people would be less bothered." Another pause. "That didn't work either." "And the third place I stayed and I worked, and I let the work speak, and the people who mattered understood it, and the people who didn't," she considered. "I stopped needing them to understand." He was quiet for a long moment. "What about this place?" he said. She looked out at the road ahead. The hills were deep gold in the late light, and somewhere behind them the sun was finishing its work for the day. "This place is different," she said. He didn't ask why, but she felt him waiting. "Because here, I'm not working alone," she said. "Mara." Pruitt moved faster than she'd expected. The first sign of it was a conversation that Ellis reported, shamefaced, the following Friday. He'd been in the barber shop in Ridgeline getting a trim, and Pruitt had been there, and Pruitt had been talking again, but different from before. Less about the operation, and more about the man. "He was saying Mr. Blackwood's not thinking clear," Ellis said. "That a man who was thinking right wouldn't be letting a—" He stopped. "Say it," Clara said. Ellis looked miserable. "A woman like you have authority over ranch business." He rushed past it. He was saying it wasn't right, that the men on the ranch deserve better than being managed by someone who's not. He stopped again. Who's not what Ellis? Who's not the right kind of person for the job, Ellis said miserably. He didn't say it any plainer than that, but everyone in there knew what he meant. Clara nodded. Anyone agree with him? Ellis thought about it carefully, which was something she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't just reassure, he actually thought. Two men I didn't know. Old Barrett from the feed store didn't say anything, but he didn't push back either. A pause. Harlan was there. He said that as far as he was concerned, the best thing that had happened to the Blackwood operation in 4 years was sitting in that ranch's kitchen, and if Pruitt had concerns about management, he was welcome to bring them to the property and see how they held up. Something moved in Clara's chest. Harlan said that, she said. Word for word, Ellis said. Pretty much cleared the room. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Ellis. She went back to what she'd been doing, but the thing in her chest kept moving for a while. The community side of Pruitt's attack, when it fully materialized, came in the form of a letter. It arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, addressed to Nathaniel on the letterhead of the Ridgeline Valley Property Association, an organization that Clara had been vaguely aware of, but had never had occasion to engage with. The letter informed Nathaniel in the polished language of a document that had been reviewed by someone with legal training that the association had received concerns from community members regarding the management practices at Blackwood Ranch. That it was the association's position that the appointment of an individual without documented ranching credentials to a management role on a significant cattle operation created potential concerns for the valley's economic standing. That the association requested a meeting to discuss these concerns at the earliest opportunity. Gerald Pruitt's name did not appear anywhere in the letter. The letter was signed by the association president, a man named Colton, who Clara knew by reputation as someone who generally did whatever Pruitt suggested, because Pruitt had helped him acquire his own land 6 years ago, and the debt of gratitude had never quite been paid off. Nathaniel read the letter at the kitchen table. Clara read it after him. She set it down. He organized fast, she said. He's been planning this for a while, Nathaniel said. His voice was controlled in the way it got when he was genuinely angry and choosing not to perform it. This isn't something you put together in a week. No, she said. He started building it before the sale, before we went to Billings. He had this ready and was waiting to see if the bank approach worked first. Nathaniel looked at her. What do you want to do? She appreciated that he asked that. She appreciated it specifically, not generally. The asking was the right reflex, the right instinct, and every time he demonstrated it, she noted it. I want to go to the meeting, she said. He waited. I want to go, and I want to be there as what I am, she said. Not as the cook, not as your employee, as the person who manages this ranch. She looked at him. But that means when we walk in there, it needs to be true in a way that's documented, in a way they can't challenge. He was quiet. I've been asking you to wait, he said. I know. I said before spring. I know, Nathaniel. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet, and the lamp burned between them. And outside the September wind was coming down off the mountains in the first suggestion that summer was nearly done. He said, I need 2 days. She said, all right. He was gone the next morning before she was up, which was notable because Clara was always up before dawn, and Nathaniel had been out the door before her exactly twice in 2 years. She found a note on the kitchen table written in his angular, economical hand. Back Thursday. Don't answer the association's letter until I return. She set the note down. She made coffee, and she waited, which was something she had always been able to do well. Not the passive waiting of a person with no options, but the still deliberate waiting of someone who knows that certain things cannot be rushed and has learned at considerable cost that rushing them makes them worse. She waited. The ranch continued to run. She managed it the way she'd been managing it, efficiently, without drama, with the quiet competence that had stopped being invisible to the people around her, even if the outside world hadn't caught up yet. Boyd reported to her Thursday morning about a fence section that needed attention. He did it directly without the old awkwardness looking at her the way you look at a foreman. Ellis asked her about the rotation schedule for the afternoon. Harlan told her that one of the younger hands had been giving the others trouble and asked how she wanted to handle it. She handled it. By the time Nathaniel rode back in on Thursday afternoon, the ranch had been running for 2 days, exactly as it should, and everyone on it had been operating under a clear and uncomplicated understanding of who was in charge. He came straight to the kitchen. He set a folder of papers on the table. He said, "Sit down, Clara." She sat. He opened the folder. Inside was a document she needed a moment to understand because the language was legal and dense, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Her name was on it. Her name and his name together in a formal partnership agreement for the operation of the Blackwood Ranch. Not an employment contract. Not a title. A partnership. With legal standing. With documentation of her stake in the decisions and the outcomes of the operation binding in the territory of Montana. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "This isn't what I asked for," she said. "No," he said. "It's more." She was quiet. "I should have done this before Billings," he said. "I should have done it the day after the sale, when I knew what you were to this operation. I was slow." A pause. "I'm not slow anymore." Her hands were on the table on either side of the papers. She looked at the document again. Her name in legal ink. Clara Whitmore. Not a cook, not an employee. A partner. "Pruitt's letter," she said. "We'll answer it together," he said. "As partners." She breathed. She had been holding something tight in her chest for a very long time, longer than this ranch, longer than Nathaniel Blackwood, longer than Montana. The particular held breath of a woman who had learned early that things given too quickly could be taken back, and who had therefore never allowed herself to fully inhale until something was real enough to trust. She looked at the paper. She looked at the ink. She looked at her name. She said, "Do you have a pen?" He set one on the table. She picked it up. She signed. The ink was barely dry on the partnership agreement when the real trouble started. Clara had expected Pruitt to be difficult. She had expected him to push back to find new angles to make noise in the ways that men like Pruitt made noise when they felt they'd been beaten at something they'd already counted as theirs. What she had not fully anticipated was how fast he would move once he understood that the informal arrangement he'd been hoping to dismantle had become something legal and documented and no longer possible to dismiss as a rancher's sentimental mistake. He found out about the partnership agreement within 48 hours. She didn't know exactly who told him. Ridgeline was a small valley, and legal filings had a way of becoming known, especially when the person they affected had friends at the Territorial Records Office. It didn't matter. What mattered was that by Saturday morning, 2 days after Clara had signed her name on that document, the word was moving through the town with a speed that told her Pruitt was not letting it travel on its own. He was pushing it. She knew because Ellis came in Saturday afternoon with his ears red and his eyes angry in the way of a young man who had heard something he wanted very badly to argue with, but had been smart enough not to. "What did they say?" Clara asked, not looking up from the accounts she was reviewing. "You don't want to know." "Ellis." He sat down at the kitchen table with the posture of someone who'd been carrying a weight for several hours. "Pruitt was at the saloon last night. He was telling people that Nathaniel's lost his sense, that a man who signs his ranch over to his cook, his words not mine, is a man who's either gone soft in the head or gone soft in another way, and either way, it's the ranch that's going to suffer." He stopped. "He said some other things about you specifically." "About my size," Clara said. Ellis looked at the table. "Yes, ma'am." "And about what a woman of my size must be doing to get a man to sign papers like that." Ellis didn't answer, which was its own answer. Clara set her pen down. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone being wounded, though the words had landed somewhere real, as those words always did, regardless of how many times you'd heard variations of them. She was quiet because she was thinking, and thinking required quiet. "Who was in the room when he said it?" she asked. "Maybe 15 men. Maybe 20. How many pushed back? Ellis thought. 3. Harlan Tom Reedy from the feed store and old Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 80 years old, had been in Montana since before it was a territory, and was respected in the valley, the way you respect a mountain, not because it does anything in particular, but because it has been there longer than anyone, and has survived more than you can imagine. If Marcus Webb had pushed back against Pruitt in a room of 20 men, that was not nothing. What did Marcus say? She asked. He said that in his experience, the man who talks the most about another man's judgment is usually the one whose own judgment is worth examining, Ellis said. And then he picked up his drink and turned his back on the whole conversation. Clara picked her pen back up. Thank you, Ellis. Is that it? You're just going to go finish the east fence section, she said. I need to write a letter. She wrote the letter to the Ridgeline Valley Property Association that afternoon. It was a precise document. 2 pages written in her clearest hand, addressing each of the concerns the association's letter had raised. She documented her 2 years of involvement in the ranch's operations, the specific contributions she had made to the financial stability of the property, the outcome of the sale in August, the situation with King, the resolution of the bank issue in Billings. She did not apologize for any of it. She did not explain herself in the defensive register of someone who felt they owed justification. She laid out facts, cited dates, attached copies of relevant documents, and ended with a single clear statement that the Blackwood Ranch partnership was a legal matter of record in the Montana territory, that Clara Whitmore was a co-owner and co-manager of that operation, and that she looked forward to discussing the association's specific concerns at the meeting they had requested. She signed it, Clara Whitmore, co-owner, Blackwood Ranch. Not ranch manager, not cook, not employee. Co-owner. She showed it to Nathaniel before sending it. He read it standing in the kitchen doorway. He read it all the way through once, and then went back and read one section again. Then he looked up. This is going to make some people angry, he said. Yes, she said. Good angry or bad angry? She thought about that. Both, she said. Some people are going to be angry because they think I'm overstepping. Those people were already against us. Some people are going to be angry because they've been sitting quietly not knowing which side to be on, and this is going to force them to decide. She paused. Undecided people, when forced to decide, usually go toward whoever is clearest. Clarity costs something, but it tends to work. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this a long time. Since the first time someone told me I didn't belong somewhere that I belonged, she said. He handed the letter back. Send it, he said. The meeting was set for the following Thursday. The intervening week was the most difficult stretch Clara had experienced since arriving at the Blackwood Ranch, and it was difficult in the particular way of waiting, not for something to happen, but for the thing that was already happening to arrive at its conclusion. Pruitt didn't stop. She had known he wouldn't, but the evidence of it still landed every day like a small cold stone. A rumor here, a comment there, the particular erosion of constant low-level noise. He was smart enough not to say anything legally actionable. He kept it in the register of concern. Concern for Nathaniel. Concern for the valley, concern about the precedent being set. He had the vocabulary of a man who had spent years getting what he wanted, while appearing to be merely worried about everyone else's well-being. 2 of the ranch's supplier accounts in Ridgeline sent notices that they were reviewing their terms. One of them, a feed supplier they'd used for 3 years, sent a man out to the ranch to discuss the account in person. Clara met him at the door because Nathaniel was in the north pasture. The man was uncomfortable from the first moment, which told her the discomfort had started before he arrived. I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood, he said. Mr. Blackwood is working, she said. I manage the accounts for this operation. If you have something to discuss, you can discuss it with me, or you can leave a written notice, and I'll have him contact you. The man looked at her. He was 40-something, decent-looking, wearing the expression of someone who had come prepared for one kind of conversation and had arrived to find a different one. You're the... he started. Clara Whitmore, she said. Co-owner. How can I help you? He reconsidered visibly. There have been some concerns raised, he said, about the stability of the operation. I was asked to. By whom? She said. He hesitated. Mr. Pruitt, she said, not asking. Another hesitation. Smaller. I was approached, he said. I see. She kept her voice completely even. Let me show you something. She brought him into the front room and showed him the bank documentation from the billings meeting. She showed him the partnership agreement. She showed him the sale figures from August. She spread it all on the table and let him look at it for as long as he needed to. When he was finished, he said, "The account terms are fine." "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate your directness." He left. She went back to the kitchen. Her hands were steady. That was something. Inside her chest was a different situation entirely, a compressed, grinding thing. That was the feeling of fighting the same battle again and again from different angles, against an opponent who had decided that her existence in a particular role was a personal affront, worth unlimited effort. She had felt this before. She had felt it at 22, at the first place when she had left. At the second place when she had shrunk. At the third place when she had stayed and worked and let the work speak. She was at the fourth place now. She picked up her pen and went back to the accounts. Nathaniel found out about the supplier visit that evening. His response was quiet and swift. He rode into Ridgeline the next morning and he made visits to 3 businesses that had standing accounts with the ranch, and he said what he needed to say in the plain, direct way he said everything, and by the time he came back in the afternoon, every account was confirmed. She didn't ask him what he'd said. He didn't offer. But Boyd mentioned at supper that he'd heard from someone in town that Nathaniel Blackwood had told the owner of the general store that any business that reconsidered its relationship with the Blackwood Ranch, based on Gerald Pruitt's suggestions, could consider its relationship with the Blackwood Ranch fully and permanently reconsidered. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Harlan said, "Good," and went back to eating. And that was that. Thursday came. The meeting of the Ridgeline Valley Property Association was held in the back room of the Ridgeline Courthouse, which was the largest indoor gathering space in town, and was used for everything from formal legal proceedings to town socials, so it carried no particular atmosphere of its own, just the accumulated weight of many different occasions. Clara and Nathaniel arrived together. She wore a clean dress, her good boots, and her apron because she was done apologizing for the apron and what it represented, and because she had decided that the people in that room were going to meet her, as she was not as a version of herself designed to make them comfortable. She carried her mother's leather satchel. There were 22 people in the room when they walked in. More than she'd expected. She scanned them quickly, Colton, the association president, at the front. 3 men she recognized as ranchers from the north end of the valley. Several merchants. 2 men she didn't know at all. And in the back corner, arms folded and expression elaborately neutral, Gerald Pruitt. She looked at Pruitt once directly, and then moved her attention to the room. Nathaniel walked beside her. He hadn't touched her elbow or guided her in. He'd walked beside her, which was the right thing, the thing that said, "We are here together, and neither of us is leading the other." Colton called the meeting to order. He was a reed-thin man in his late 40s, pleasant-faced and hollow-eyed, the kind of man who had been important in a small way for long enough that he'd started to believe the small way was a large one. He read from prepared notes. He was careful with his language, careful enough that Clara could hear the legal review behind it, the deliberate avoidance of anything that could be called discrimination, while still managing to convey that the association had concerns about the suitability and credentialed background of individuals placed in significant management roles in valley operations. Every word was chosen. Every phrase had been worked over. She waited until he was finished. Then she stood up. She hadn't planned to stand. She had planned to remain seated and address things calmly from her chair. But something in her, some instinct that had been calibrated over years of knowing when stillness was the right answer, and when standing up was told her to get to her feet. So she stood. "Mr. Colton," she said, "thank you for the statement. I'd like to address the concerns raised. Colton looked mildly surprised, the way people who weren't quite sure how to handle her always looked mildly surprised. We typically allow. The letter you sent was addressed to Mr. Blackwood, she said. The concerns raised are about me. I'd appreciate the opportunity to respond to them directly if the association is willing to hear it. If not, I'd ask you to say so plainly. A small silence. One of the ranchers from the north end, a man named Garrett, 60-ish, weather-faced, said, "Let her speak." Colton looked at Pruitt. Just a flicker. Just enough. Clara saw it. She stored it. "Of course," Colton said. She opened her mother's leather satchel and set her documentation on the table in front of her. She didn't look at it. She knew what was in it, and she didn't need the papers to speak. The papers were for afterward for anyone who needed to see it written down. She told them who she was. Not in the way of self-promotion. She had never been comfortable with self-promotion, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But with the direct, undecorated honesty of someone who has decided that the question of their credibility is going to be answered once and answered completely. She talked about her background, where she came from, who her mother was, what she had learned, and how she had learned it. She talked about her 2 years at the Blackwood Ranch without making them sound more than they were. She was specific, and specific was always more convincing than general. The sale in August, the figures, the bank meeting. King's infection, what it would have cost if it had gone another week. The East parcel note, and how close it had come to being a real problem. The supplier accounts that were currently confirmed and stable. She talked for 23 minutes. Nobody interrupted her. When she finished, she said, "I understand that some people in this valley have concerns about what I represent in this role. Some of those concerns are about convention, and some of them are about something else that nobody in this room is likely to name directly. I won't pretend I don't know what that something else is." She paused. "What I can tell you is that the Blackwood Ranch is more financially stable than it has been in 4 years, that its accounts are current, its herd is healthy, and its position in the valley's cattle market is stronger than it's been since before the drought. Those are documented facts. I'd invite anyone in this room to bring a specific concern to me based on those facts, and I'll address it." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Garrett, the North End rancher, spoke first. "I've got no concerns," he said. "My concern was about whether there was real management at Blackwood or not. Sounds like there is." One of the men she hadn't recognized stood up. He was 50-ish, square built, and he had been watching her the entire time she spoke with an expression she hadn't been able to read. "I represent the Billings Consortium," he said. "We're expanding our purchase territory into this valley next spring. We've been doing preliminary assessments of reliable operations to include in our network." He paused. "The Blackwood Ranch is on our list. Miss Whitmore's reputation came up in our research before we came to this meeting." The room shifted. Clara kept her expression even. But something in her chest did a thing that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. Something between the two. The feeling of a thing you'd known was possible, but hadn't let yourself count on until it arrived. "In a positive sense," Colton said with the tone of a man recalibrating. "In a very positive sense," the man said. "Mr. Holt speaks highly of this operation. He was specific." He looked at Clara. He was specific about why. From the back corner of the room, Gerald Pruitt had gone very still. Clara looked at him. Not with triumph. She was not a triumphant person by nature. Triumph felt like a flavor of the same dish as humiliation, and she had no interest in either. She looked at him the way you look at something you've finished dealing with. Not hate, not satisfaction, just completion. Pruitt looked back at her, and for the first time since this had started, she saw something in his face that was not calculation or contempt. It was the beginning of understanding that he had lost. The meeting ended with nothing resolved formally, and everything resolved practically, which was how these things usually ended when the facts were clearly on one side. Colton thanked everyone for attending. The association's concerns were deemed addressed for the time being in language so carefully neutral that it essentially meant we are not going to pursue this further, but we are not going to say so directly." Several men who hadn't spoken during the meeting came up to Nathaniel afterward and shook his hand and said things about the ranch that were complimentary and pointed in their specificity. Two of them also shook Clara's hand. She shook back, looking each man in the eye, saying thank you without excess warmth and without withholding. The Billings Consortium man, his name was Archer. She learned asked if she'd be willing to meet with him before he left town. She said she would. They arranged it for the following morning. Garrett, the North End rancher, stopped her on the way out. He was a big man, the kind of big that came from a lifetime of physical work, and he had the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to sort people accurately. "I've got a daughter," he said. 24. She runs the books for our operation. She's good. Better than good." He paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to give her more responsibility for 3 years, and every time I get close, the valley does what it did today, and I pull back." He stopped. He looked at Clara steadily. "I'm going to stop pulling back." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Tell her to come see me if she wants to talk," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and walked out. Right. Nathaniel was quiet on the way home. Not an unhappy quiet. She'd learned his silences well enough to read them, and this one was the kind that followed something significant, the processing quiet of a man working through the implications of what had just happened. She let him have it. They were about 2 miles out of Ridgeline when he said Archer. "Yes," she said. "The Billings Consortium wanting to include us in their network." "It's good news. It's better than good news," he said. "It's a guaranteed buyer relationship that doesn't depend on spot market prices. It's stability." He paused. "Holt told him about you." "Apparently." "Preston Holt doesn't recommend things carelessly," Nathaniel said. "I've known of him for years. He doesn't say things for the sake of saying them." "I know," she said. Another silence. "The meeting with Archer tomorrow," he said. "I'll be there." "I know you will," she said, "but let me open it." He glanced at her. "It's my relationship," she said simply. "Holt built it. Let me handle it." A beat. "All right," he said. She looked out at the road. The afternoon was cooling, and the light was going long and gold the way Montana light went in late September, that particular generosity of angle that made everything look like it was worth keeping. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yeah." "Pruitt isn't done," she said. "Today was a setback for him, not a conclusion." He was quiet for a moment. "I know." "He's going to look for something personal," she said. "Something that doesn't have a document attached to it. Something about us, about the nature of the arrangement, that he can use to make the professional question feel like a moral one." Nathaniel's jaw set slightly. "He can try." "He will try," she said. "I want us to be prepared for it." What does prepared look like? She thought about it carefully. "It looks like being exactly what we are and not apologizing for any part of it," she said. "The work, the partnership, all of it." She paused. "And it looks like deciding before he forces the question what the answer to that question actually is." She felt him looking at her. She kept her eyes on the road. The wagon moved through the September light steady and unhurried, and the ranch was still an hour ahead of them, and the question she had just put between them was sitting in the space where the reins ran slack between Nathaniel's hands. He didn't answer right away. She didn't expect him to. He was a man who took words seriously enough not to waste them, and the question she'd just asked, however carefully she'd wrapped it in strategy and preparation, was not a strategic question. They both knew it. It was the question that had been building since the night she'd set 25 steaks on a table and walked back to the kitchen without asking for recognition. And it was the question that the ledger on the kitchen table and Billings and the partnership agreement had been circling without landing. And it was the question that Garrett's comment about his daughter and Holt's recommendation to Archer and Marcus Webb turning his back on Pruitt in the saloon had been pushing slowly into territory where it could no longer be avoided. They were a mile from the ranch when Nathaniel said, "Clara." She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead, both hands on the reins, the same posture he always had on this wagon on this road, but something in him was different in the particular way of a man who has finished deciding something and is about to say what he decided. "I'm not going to let Pruitt force the question," he said. "That's not how I want to answer it." She waited. "But I also don't want to leave it sitting there much longer," he said. "Because it's sitting there whether or not either of us says so, and I think we both know that, and I'd rather be the kind of man who says a thing plainly than the kind who waits until circumstances decide for him." The ranch gate was ahead of them. The hands were finishing the day's work, moving between the barn and the corral, the familiar evening sounds of a working ranch settling into its close. "Then say it plainly," she said. He pulled the wagon to a stop just outside the gate. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. "I would like to know," he said, "whether the partnership we put on paper last week is the only kind of partnership you'd consider." It was simply said, plainly, without decoration or hedging. He said it the way he said all difficult true things, like a man who had thought about them for long enough that the saying of them was the least complicated part. Clara held his gaze. She had spent a long time in her life being in places where the question of her value was the question, where every room she walked into required her to spend energy defending her right to be there, to be taken seriously, to be heard. She had learned to manage that expenditure carefully, to not spend it in places where it wouldn't return anything, to reserve it for the places and the people worth spending it on. She had spent a great deal of it here, on this ranch, on this man, on this valley. It had returned more than she'd put in. She said, "Ask me something more specific, and I'll give you a more specific answer." And Nathaniel Blackwood, who was a man who said things plainly, said the specific thing. The horses stood at the gate in the September light, and Clara Whitmore, who had spent her whole life knowing exactly what she knew and trusting it completely, said yes. The word spread the way all words spread in a small valley faster than anyone intended, and with more detail than anyone planned. By Friday morning, 2 days after the wagon had stopped outside the ranch gate in the September light, at least 4 people in Ridgeline knew that Nathaniel Blackwood had asked Clara Whitmore to marry him. By Saturday, it was a dozen. By the following Tuesday, when Nathaniel rode into town to file the amended partnership paperwork with the territorial clerk, the clerk had congratulated him before he'd said a word about why he was there. Nathaniel had said thank you, completed his business, and ridden home. He told Clara about it that evening at the kitchen table, and she had laughed a real laugh, the kind that came up unexpectedly and couldn't be managed because she had spent 2 years being invisible in this valley, and now she apparently couldn't do anything without the entire population having opinions about it. "How did they find out?" she asked. "Ellis," Nathaniel said without particular surprise. "Of course," she said. Ellis, when confronted the next morning, turned the color of a July sunset and said that he had told exactly one person, which was Tom Reedy's son at the feed store, which was the same as telling the entire valley, and he knew it, and he was sorry. Clara told him it was all right. It was all right. Mostly. What was not entirely all right was what Pruitt did with the information. She'd known he would do something. She'd told Nathaniel on the wagon ride home that Pruitt would look for something personal when the professional approach failed, and she had been right, and she had prepared herself for it. But preparation and arrival are different things, and what Pruitt chose to do was precise enough and mean enough that even having anticipated something, she felt the particular cold weight of it when it came. He started a new conversation in town. The conversation went like this. Nathaniel Blackwood, a recently widowed man, never mind that Margaret had been gone 4 years, had been manipulated by a woman who had positioned herself carefully over time to secure a financial stake in his operation, and was now completing that work by securing a marital one. The implication was clear. The implication was that Clara was strategic in the wrong sense, that her competence was a performance, that the value she had brought to the ranch was a calculated means to an end, and that end was Nathaniel's property. It was the cruelest thing Pruitt could have said, because it took everything real about her, the work, the genuine investment, the honest care, and reframed it as manipulation. It made her authenticity look like its opposite. She heard about it on a Wednesday from Harlan, who told her with the careful expression of a man delivering something heavy and sharp. She sat with it for exactly 1 day. Then she made a decision. She was going to Ridgeline, alone. Not to confront Pruitt directly. She had no interest in a direct confrontation with Pruitt, who would only use the spectacle of it to reinforce his version of events. She was going to do something quieter and more lasting. She was going to be seen. She told Nathaniel what she planned. He looked at her with the steady attention he always gave her when she said something he didn't fully understand yet. "You're going to go to town," he said. "And do what?" "Exist," she said. "Visibly. In my own right. Not as your cook, not as your partner, not as your future wife, as myself." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to go alone?" "Yes." He didn't argue. That was one of the things she had come to value most in him. He knew when her decision was hers to make. "All right," he said. She went on Thursday morning. She went to the general store first and settled the supply account for the month, conducting the transaction with the same directness she brought to everything, talking about specifics and quantities and pricing, with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it required no effort. The store owner, a man named Henderson, watched her across the counter, with something shifting in his expression, the particular look of someone who is in the process of replacing an assumption with an observation. She gave him nothing to be uncomfortable about. She was simply herself doing the work she did, taking up the space she occupied. She went to the bank where she made a deposit against the operating account and reviewed a notation on the account records that needed correcting. The teller addressed her as Miss Whitmore without hesitation. She addressed him by name. She was there for 20 minutes. She stopped at Tom Reedy's feed store. Tom Reedy was a big, ruddy-faced man who had opinions about most things and was usually willing to share them. He had, according to various reports, been somewhat neutral on the question of Clara throughout the entire episode, not hostile, not particularly supportive, waiting to see how things settled. He looked up when she walked in. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Reedy." She put her list on the counter. "I need to place the fall order." He looked at the list. He looked at her. He made the particular small decision that people make when they've been neutral long enough and the moment has come to stop. "I heard Pruitt's been talking again," he said. "I imagine he has," she said. "What he's been saying." Reedy started, then stopped. "I want you to know that I don't—" "You don't need to tell me what you don't think," she said, not unkindly. "I'd rather hear what you do think." He blinked. Then he said, "I think the Blackwood Ranch is the strongest operation in this valley right now, and I think that didn't happen by accident, and I think the person who had the most to do with it is standing in my store right now, placing her fall order." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Reedy." "You want that order delivered Friday." "Friday is fine," she said. She walked out into the Ridgeline street and stood for a moment in the thin October sun. The street was ordinary. Men going about their business horses at the hitching posts, the sound of the blacksmith somewhere down the block. An ordinary day in an ordinary town that had been having an extraordinary argument about whether she had the right to be what she was. She had let the argument answer itself. One transaction at a time, one conversation at a time, one room at a time. That was the only way she had ever known to do it. The wedding was in November. Not a large affair, neither of them wanted large. They held it at the ranch in the main room with Harlan and Ellis and Boyd and the rest of the hands present. And Garrett from the North Valley brought his daughter, whose name was June, and who shook Clara's hand with the grip of a young woman who had been waiting a long time for permission to take up more space. The circuit preacher from Billings performed the ceremony. Nathaniel wore his good coat and a new hat that he'd bought without telling anyone, and that Ellis had made a point of noticing loudly enough that everyone in the room knew about it. Clara wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she'd ordered from Denver, deep blue, which was a color she had never allowed herself because she had spent too many years dressing to disappear. The dress was not designed to disappear. It was designed for a woman who had stopped trying to. She carried her mother's metal herb tin in her pocket. Because some things you carry forward. The ceremony was short and plain, and entirely true, which was the only kind of ceremony either of them would have wanted. When the preacher asked if Nathaniel took Clara as his wife, Nathaniel said he did with the same direct simplicity with which he said all important things. When the preacher asked if Clara took Nathaniel as her husband, she said she did, and meant it in every register, the practical and the personal, the clear-eyed and the tender, all of it at once. Harlan in the front row looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who was going to deny absolutely that his eyes had done anything. Ellis did not even try to pretend. June Garrett held her own hands very still in her lap and watched with the expression of someone filing something important away. The amended deed arrived from the territorial office in December. Nathaniel brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and Clara came and stood beside him, and they opened it together. The document was formal and dense, in the way of legal instruments, and most of it was language they'd already reviewed and approved, and neither of them needed to read much of it to get to the part that mattered. The names listed as co-owners of the Blackwood Ranch property. Nathaniel Blackwood. Clara Blackwood. She had taken his name. She had thought about this carefully because she was a woman who thought about everything carefully, and she had decided that a name was not a surrender of self. Her mother had taught her who she was in a way that didn't live in a name. It lived in the tin in her pocket, and the way she held a skillet, and the 48 months of perfect repayment records, and the 25 stakes she'd set on a table in August, and changed the shape of her own future. A name was just a name. But her name on that deed beside his was not just a name. It was the legal and permanent and unarguable record of a fact that had been true for a long time before the paper said so. She set the deed back on the table. Nathaniel put his hand over hers. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Pruitt left Ridgeline in January. She didn't know this for certain until Harlan mentioned it in passing one morning. The way you mention weather, a fact of the landscape, neither good nor bad, simply what was. His land brokerage had apparently lost enough business in the valley that the operation was no longer viable. Several property owners who had worked with him for years had quietly moved their accounts elsewhere. The Billings Bank, whose loan officer had apparently done his own reassessment of whom he should be listening to, had declined to continue a consulting arrangement Pruitt had relied on. He hadn't said goodbye to anyone as far as anyone knew. He had simply gone. Clara heard it and thought, that is what happens when a man builds his position entirely on other people's doubt. When the doubt stops, the position stops with it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, if anything, a vast and practical calm. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard in the way that Montana winters were always hard, which was completely and without apology. The ranch got through it. There were 2 weeks in February when the temperature dropped to something that made going outside feel like an argument you were losing, and 3 of the younger cattle got sick and had to be brought inside the south barn and watched, and a section of the east fence came down under the weight of accumulated ice and took 2 days to repair, in conditions that Ellis described with feeling as the worst 2 days of his short life. Clara had been out there helping with the fence. Boyd had looked at her when she appeared with her tools and her coat and her practical expression, and had said nothing whatsoever, which was the highest form of acceptance she'd received from him, and which she received as such. When the fence was repaired and everyone was back inside and warming their hands on coffee cups, Harlan had said to the room in general, "All right, we got through it." And there had been a quality in the collective exhale of the room that was more than relief about a fence. It was the particular warmth of people who have gone through something difficult together and have confirmed by getting through it that they are the kind of people who get through things. Clara had looked around the kitchen at these men at Harlan with his weathered, quiet Boyd, with his earned respect, Ellis still growing into his own face, and had felt something she didn't always let herself feel, which was belonging. Not the performing kind. Not the provisional kind that required her to earn it again every day. The real kind, The settled kind. The kind that doesn't need to be announced because it's simply true. Poem. Spring came, and with it, the Billings Consortium. Archer arrived in April with 2 other representatives and spent 2 days at the ranch, conducting the kind of thorough assessment that serious buyers conduct before making long-term commitments. He had been professional and thorough and not unkind, and he had addressed himself equally to Clara and Nathaniel throughout, which she noted and appreciated without making a point of it. On the second day, he asked to meet with Clara alone for an hour. She met with him in the front room, the ledger open on the desk, her documentation organized and complete. He asked detailed questions about the breeding program, the rotation schedule, the cost structure, the herd health record over the past year. He asked about King, specifically about the infection and the recovery and what she attributed the early identification to. He asked about the east parcel water access and the plans for expanding the north pasture. She answered everything. At the end of the hour, he said, "We'd like to offer a 3-year preferred supplier agreement. Guaranteed minimum purchase each season at a price floor that's indexed to market, but with a base that insulates you from the worst fluctuations." She looked at the numbers he set on the table. They were good numbers. Better than she had projected when she'd first started modeling this possibility 5 months ago. "I'll need to discuss the terms with my husband," she said. "Of course," he said. She discussed them with Nathaniel that evening. He read the offer, asked her 3 specific questions, listened to her answers, and said, "What do you think?" "I think we should take it," she said. "Then we take it," he said. They signed the following morning. What nobody in the valley had fully understood in all the months of argument about whether Clara Whitmore belonged where she had placed herself was what she had actually been doing during that time. She had been building, not loudly, not with announcements or campaigns or appeals to fairness. Just steadily, the way you build something meant to last, with attention to the foundation and patience with the pace, and the clear understanding that what you are building will only stand if it can hold its own weight without your hands on it. The breeding program she and Nathaniel had redesigned over the winter produced its first significant results. That spring, a cohort of calves from the Hereford cross she had advocated for healthier and better proportioned than the previous generation. With a market value that made the spring rotation numbers the strongest the ranch had posted in 6 years. June Garrett came to see her in April, as her father had suggested she might. She was a sharp-eyed young woman, 24, with the particular combination of competence and suppressed frustration that Clara recognized immediately and entirely. They talked for 3 hours at the kitchen table. Clara showed her the ledger systems she'd developed, the documentation process, the way she tracked the herd health data, alongside the financial data, to build a complete picture of the operation's position at any given moment. June said, "My father lets me do the books, but he doesn't let me come to the buyer meetings." "Tell him I said to let you come," Clara said. June looked at her. "Will that work?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but it will work better than not saying anything. And if it doesn't work, come back and we'll figure out the next step." June left with a different posture than she'd arrived with. Clara watched her ride out and thought about her mother, who had taught her everything she knew in a kitchen in Kansas, and who had never had a Clara to tell her father to let her into the buyer meetings. She was going to be someone's that for as many women as she could manage. That was not a plan, she stated aloud. It was simply a fact she had arrived at, the way she arrived at most important facts, quietly, completely, without needing to announce it. In June, Preston Holt came back. He came alone this time, without Kane and Finch, which was different enough from August that Clara noticed it immediately when Nathaniel brought him into the front room. He sat down with the deliberate ease of a man who is exactly where he intended to be, and he took coffee when it was offered, and he looked around the front room of the Blackwood Ranch main house with the particular attention of someone who has been to a place before and is noting what has changed. "You've made some improvements," he said. "We have," Nathaniel said. Holt looked at Clara. "I heard about the consortium agreement," he said. "News travels," she said. "In my industry, it does," he said. Archer spoke well of the meeting. A pause. "He mentioned you specifically." He said the documentation was the most thorough he'd encountered in a Western Territory operation of this size. She said, "We work hard on it." "I know," Holt said. He held her gaze. "I made a recommendation. When Archer was putting together his Montana assessment, I told him that the Blackwood Ranch was the operation to prioritize." He paused. "I want you to know I made that recommendation because of specific things I observed in August. Not because of sentiment." She understood what he was doing. He was giving her the record of it, saying plainly to her face in a way that could not be undone or reinterpreted, "I saw what you were. I said so." That had consequences. Men like Holt did not do that casually. "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded once. Then he set his coffee down and said, "I'd like to discuss expanding the relationship between my consortium and this operation, not as a secondary arrangement under the Billings Agreement, as a separate direct contract." Nathaniel said, "We're listening." What followed was 2 hours of the most substantive negotiation Clara had conducted since Billings. Holt was a different kind of negotiator from Tolliver, different even from his own style in August, less guarded, less testing. He had made up his mind about what they were before he arrived, and the negotiation was not about convincing him of anything. It was about working out the specifics of a deal between people who had already decided they could trust each other's numbers. Clara laid out their position clearly. Herd capacity, projected growth over the next 2 seasons, the breeding program results, and what they indicated about quality trajectory. She was specific about what they could commit to, and honest about what remained uncertain. She did not oversell. Holt did not try to underbuy. When they arrived at terms, she wrote them down, and he reviewed them, and he said, "That's accurate," and signed. It was the cleanest negotiation she had ever been part of. Afterward, when Holt was preparing to leave, and the late June light was going long and warm through the windows, he stopped in the doorway and said something she had not expected. "Last August," he said, "when I said the cook changed the picture." He paused. "I've thought about that phrase since. I said it because it was the language that was available to me in that moment. It was an incomplete description of what had actually happened." She looked at him. "What had actually happened," he said, "was that someone who understood the value of what was in front of her showed it to people who were too fixed in their assumptions to see it themselves." He put on his hat. "That is not the work of a cook. That is the work of someone who understands the whole operation and has the confidence to act on that understanding." He paused one final time. "I should have said your name." He walked out. Clara stood in the doorway of the front room for a long moment. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand at the small of her back, just the warmth of it, and they stood together and watched Preston Holt ride down the lane toward the Valley Road. The summer of 1884 was the best summer the Blackwood Ranch had known since before the drought. The herd was at 460 head. The east parcels were fully secured, the note long paid. The north pasture expansion Clara had proposed the previous fall was underway, and the first section of new fence was already standing. The bunkhouse had a new roof, the south barn had been repaired, and the kitchen stove, finally at Clara's insistence, before one more Montana winter, had been replaced with a new one that didn't require coaxing and interpretation to operate correctly. She still had the old one's iron handle on her windowsill. Some things you keep. 3 of the Blackwood calves from the Hereford Cross went to the Billings Consortium that summer at prices that caused Archer to write a personal note rather than just a form receipt. The note said in part that the quality was exceptional and that the consortium looked forward to an ongoing relationship. Clara filed the note in the ledger. She filed everything in the ledger. Cheng. In August, exactly 1 year after the night, she had set 25 steaks on a table and changed the shape of her own life. Clara walked out to the east pasture in the early morning, before the hands were up, before Nathaniel was awake, while the sky was still doing the thing it did in Montana at that hour, where the dark hadn't fully committed to becoming light. She stood at the fence. She looked at the cattle. She thought about the woman who had stood in a kitchen doorway 1 year ago and said, "Give me 1 hour," who had said it without knowing for certain how it would go, only knowing that she understood what no one else in that situation had understood, and that understanding was worth something, and that something was worth saying, even when no one had asked her to say it. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into in her life and not been seen. She thought about what it had cost her, and what she had built from the cost of it, and how those two things were not separate, but the same thing, the paying and the building happening simultaneously, the way they always do when a person is both being shaped by their circumstances and shaping them back. She put her hand in her apron pocket. Her fingers found the tin. Her mother's tin worn smooth at the edges, the lid loose from 1,000 openings. She took it out and held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was not heavy in any physical sense, but carried everything. Her mother's kitchen in Kansas, 30 years of feeding strangers with dignity. The knowledge passed hand to hand that real value does not announce itself. It shows itself in the work, in the consistency, in the quiet accumulation of effort applied to something worth building. She closed her fingers around it. Behind her she heard boots on the path from the house. She knew the sound. She had learned it the way you learn the particular sounds of the place where you belong. Nathaniel stopped beside her at the fence. He didn't ask what she was doing out here at this hour. He understood the kind of person she was well enough by now to know that some mornings required space and quiet and the company of your own thoughts before the day began. He stood with her. After a while he said quietly, "You all right?" She looked at the cattle in the early light, her herd hers documented and signed and real grazing in the pasture that bore her name on its deed. "Yes," she said, and it was true in every direction she could measure it. He stood beside her a while longer. Then he said, "Coffee's on." She looked at him. This man who had looked at her for 2 years without seeing her, and then had seen her all at once and had not looked away since. "I'll be in," she said. He nodded and walked back toward the house. She stayed at the fence a moment more. She looked at the land, her land, the pastures and the fence lines and the hills beyond them, and the sky above all of it, going from dark to light, in the slow, inevitable way that mornings go, without asking permission from anyone, without requiring anyone's recognition to proceed. She put the tin back in her pocket. She turned and walked back toward the house, toward the kitchen, toward the coffee and the ledger and the day's work, and the life she had built piece by careful piece out of everything the world had tried to tell her she wasn't. A woman who knows what she's worth does not wait for the world to agree. She sets the table, she does the work, and she stays.